Hey guys, so it's been a hot minute. I have to apologize for the delay because I did tell myself when I started the lessons on this channel that I would stay consistent in posting, that I could develop it so much as a habit. Because if I don't, then I would get distracted and I would tell myself, hey, I'll do it tomorrow. And then tomorrow turns into a week, and then a week turns into a month, and then another month goes by, and then it ends up being 6 months later. However, this time is not due to my ADHD. So I technically have not failed at this goal. Instead, I've been dealing with an unexpected legal battle that has been taking up a lot of my time and has forced me to move 3 times in 5 months. However, I'm going to save that story for another lesson. But I will say it's been a life changing experience. I've also learned so much about myself that I never even considered, or in fact, about humankind in general. Already aware that how I perceive others, expectations, even information is different from the norm. I mean, I did do a whole lesson on it, which was, I think, believe lesson 2, which is called Most People. The sense of being different only came about after the breakup with my ex back in 2019. Before then, I knew I was unique, but I didn't feel different. However, as I've gotten older, I've felt more and more different as I continue to face certain challenges and how I tend to manage them or respond to them. This has become even more apparent with my current legal battle because I kept finding myself having to explain to others why I was putting myself through the stress of having to fight for something. I had to keep emphasizing how it was the principle of the matter, and somehow people just didn't seem to understand that. I would be told, like, why don't you just take the easy route? This would be the easier thing to do, or just let it go. But that thought process is mentally insane to me. I mean, then what is the point of laws and our legal system? I mean, what about justice and what is fair? So during this process, it really started to bum me and burn me out, affecting my ability to work and questioning all that I've learned in human design and astrology. I mean, I moved to this area to pursue abundance and my destiny according to my astrocartography, not to battle an entire county. But you know what? I'm a knowledge seeker and a fixer. If something is broken or if there's something I don't understand, then I know it's something that I'm missing. Now, sometimes those answers reveal themselves easily, and some I am still searching for to this day. But this time around, the answer actually found me because one part of this legal battle involved me reaching out to my previous therapist. And as fate would have it, this gave her the opportunity to share some new research she came across, and it felt that it fit me to the T. And man, I have to say a line that I often say: if I knew then what I know now, my life would be so much different. As for my astrology or human design, this process has actually opened my eyes to understanding these nuances that I didn't see before. The past couple of years, there has been a lot of research done around women and mental health. Believe it or not, women have not commonly been involved in studies, especially in regards to personality disorders and neurodevelopmental disorders. Most have focused on men. The basic thought process was, well, why do we have to? I mean, for women, it really seemed to always boil down to our cycle. And prior to that, that was just hysteria. Prior to the full study of anatomy, hysteria was caused by our uteruses floating around in our bodies, making us go mad. But even after they figured out that uteruses actually stay in their rightful places, it was still blamed. In fact, women weren't allowed to ride on steam trains because they were afraid the speed of the train would cause the uterus to become displaced. Honestly, I truly wish that was the answer to all of women's challenges, but it's not. I will admit, I haven't done extensive research on the concept of neurodivergence. It was a relatively new term to me, and initially I mistakenly thought that it only referred to autism. I've since learned, of course, that this isn't true. I've also held a preconceived idea of what autism looked like, only to realize that those assumptions were also incorrect. This is because my studies have largely focused on personality disorders. When I first looked into autism, I really only examined stereotypes, particularly the supposed lack of empathy and social abnormalities. While I now understand that these are oversimplified misconceptions, they do stem from the DSM diagnostic criteria, which does include challenges in social communication and understanding societal norms. So, keeping that in mind, when my therapist said that recent research has shown that women that have ADHD, like myself, have a high comorbidity of being on the spectrum, something called odd DHD, my initial reaction was actually defensive because I have empathy. In fact, I have too much of it, so much so fact that it could become overbearing at time. And I don't have a problem socializing. I mean, I ran social events. How can I be on the spectrum? I have since come to learn that the reality of autism or being neurodivergent is far more complex. And my belief that the science of psychology is too outdated and rigid to truly understand human nature has only become more solidified. The terms neurodivergent, ADHD, and autism are often seen as disorders or conditions that need to be fixed. This notion is currently, of course, being revolutionized by many in the psychology community, and I agree. They should be viewed as gifts that need to be embraced. Roughly about 20% of the population is known to be on the neurodivergent spectrum, and that's just the diagnosed cases. But what percentage does it become common? Like, when does psychology stop labeling it as a disorder and start recognizing it as some evolutionary development in humanity? Because from my perspective, what I've learned, it would make more logical sense to look at this as evolution, which coincidentally aligns with the concepts discussed in human design as a reason for its emergence. But I'm going to discuss this more in detail later. However, I want to make it clear I'm not trying to add a metaphysical spin here or rely on the wooiness of a prophecy, but conventional science has many faults, one of which is closed mindedness. Many of the greatest scientific discoveries have come from people who explore all facets of knowledge. Isaac Newton, who discovered gravity and also developed calculus, also studied alchemy in great depths and was believed to be bipolar. Galileo and Kepler were both astronomers and astrologers. Their curiosity about the unknown led to the foundational knowledge that we have today. I bring this up because discovering more about myself after 43 years of searching and studying psychology to understand a side of me that I just couldn't quite grasp has finally given me some answers. And the timing of these discoveries is significant. If I was to look at my life from the outside through the lens of human design or astrology, everything is actually unfolding right on schedule as I'm finishing out my Uranus opposition. This is a time in one's life between ages 38 to 44 where you go through these major life transitions to put you on the path towards your correct purpose. In addition, it helps you kind of grow the fuck up and become the person you're meant to be. It's bringing you to your true north. Yet, of course, most people would dismiss references to human design or astrology as pseudoscience. Modern science disregards them because they aren't based on empirical evidence or the scientific method. But what's considered valid or pseudoscience or normal has shifted throughout history. If you travel back to the Renaissance era, psychology would have been seen as pseudoscience, while astrology was a credible tool for understanding a person's character and destiny. So much so, in fact, that it was illegal to cast a chart for royalty or a politician, as it would reveal secrets that could undermine their power. While the scientific method is crucial, astrology actually predates it, and science has refused to spend time applying it to these methods because they don't care to, or they don't really have the knowledge or understanding what these modalities actually bring. But as for empirical evidence, that's often a double-edged sword in psychology. Decades ago, evidence-based studies advised parents not to hug their children or babies and claimed that children were actually blank slates and gender differences didn't matter. These facts end up causing more harm than good. Empirical evidence cannot be an absolute in a field that has so much uncharted territory. It's like claiming that we understand the entire ocean when we've only explored 5% of it. Yet, the principles behind astrology and the root system that built human design have remained constant since the dawn of civilization, only updating the terminology with new discoveries. Meanwhile, psychological theories on what's considered normal or disordered have shifted repeatedly since Freud put psychology on the map. It also doesn't help that psychology is a field that is also very hypocritical, as it deems a disorder as subjected to personal beliefs of what is normal in popular opinion, not actually empirical evidence. Take, for example, the DSM that was released in 1952. Homosexuality was listed as a personality disorder, a sociopathic personality disturbance, in fact, akin to what is now called antisocial personality disorder that most serial killers possess. And this stayed in the book until 1973. Yet, homosexuality was widely accepted, even celebrated in ancient societies until around the 4th century. It only changed when Christian influence began to shape laws and societal norms. Today, it's widely accepted, though, as a natural variation of human experience, though there are some who unfortunately remain stuck in a fixed mindset. The biggest problem is the word normal or the phrase societal norms. People often mistake these terms as synonymous with what is right rather than what is common. This confusion arises because the word abnormal is typically associated with being wrong, different, or undesirable. Being abnormal, however, should be more closely linked to being unique because it is our differences that provide opportunities for survival. Take genetics, for example. Genetic diversity or having different genes from one another protects us from being vulnerable to the same diseases. The more appropriate term to use is common or common society. It's a common belief, but it doesn't mean it's the right one. For instance, if it was common for everyone to jump off a bridge at age 16, that would be considered the normal thing to do. Yet the one person who saw the danger and chose not to jump would be labeled as abnormal, but they would also be the one who survives. Normal is simply the status quo, and it's often the abnormal that drives meaningful change, whether that abnormal aspect is good or bad. We are forced to adapt when harmful abnormal behaviors poses a threat, but we advance when beneficial abnormal behavior leads to discoveries because someone thought outside the normal box. And that is where being classified as neurodivergent lies. So, what does it mean to be neurodivergent? Neurodivergence is an umbrella term for people whose brains develop or function differently for a variety of reasons. There's some debate about which psychological conditions fall under this term. Most commonly, it involves neurodevelopmental disorders listed in the DSM 5, but I've also read that bipolar disorder, which is technically classified as a mood disorder, can be also included. Additionally, some sources suggest that any personality disorder might also be considered neurodivergent. However, these different classifications are debated, and most people tend to stick with conditions like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, which obviously encompasses autism and what was formerly known as Asperger's, dyslexia or related motor dysfunctions, synesthesia, and sensory deprivation disorders or traits seen in highly sensitive people. However, I believe that using the term disorder is very problematic because within each of these diagnoses lies a spectrum, but it really depends on how many traits a person exhibits and how much these traits interfere with or negatively impact their daily life and relationship. How much harm does it cause the individual or those around them? And psychology complicates these further by labeling these as disorders and categorizing them, even though all mental health complications or divergences really could be seen in variations of neurodevelopment. This also might explain why there's so many misdiagnoses. Personality is unique to each individual. And when you throw in factors like brain function, empathy, cognitive processing, culture, and personal beliefs, it becomes nearly impossible to pinpoint who has what or what counts as normal. But instead, we judge, stigmatize, and funnel it all into big pharma, which profits immensely from normalizing individuals to meet society standards. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that all medication is bad, but I do think it's dangerous to prescribe it to anyone under the age of 25 when our brain is still developing, especially in children. There is nothing scarier to me than the idea of giving powerful drugs to kids just because they seem a little different when we have no real understanding how those pills are going to actually impact that developing brain. Now, yes, medication may help suppress challenging aspects, but you also have to realize that it's going to suppress a person's unique gifts as well, and it prevents them from fully understanding who they are, what makes them special. In all honesty, it's a little bit reminiscent of when people thought that frontal lobotomies were a good idea to handle hysteria. Sure, it got rid of the so-called crazy, but it also stripped away all aspects of their personality. I mean, see what I mean by the dangers of this empirical evidence in psychology? We were once convinced removing a portion of a person's brain would cure them because, hey, science said so. So allow me to break away from the psychological status quo and explain some of these sensory sensitive neurodivergent classifications and what they truly look like beyond the DSM's criteria, and showcasing what their gifts can be also despite their challenges. Because after all, every blessing ignored becomes a curse, especially in psychology. First classification is called synesthesia. This is one of the fascinating quirks of the human brain. It's a phenomenon where their senses intertwine in unexpected ways. It's where one type of sensory input automatically triggers another one. So think of hearing colors or seeing sounds or pairing numbers with vibrant colors. It's not something that a person decides to do, it just happens, and it creates this unique lens through which some people experience the world. Now, for those with synesthesia, life can feel a little like stepping into a creative wonderland. So it's no surprise that many that have this thrive in artistic or musical fields. Their minds naturally paint connections that others may not even imagine. Think of Vincent van Gogh or Pharrell Williams, whose art and music have said to be influenced by this phenomenon. Synesthesia often enhances memory too. Imagine associating colors with letters or numbers. It's like a built-in mnemonic device that makes remembering sequences a breeze. And everyday life for them can feel more vibrant and alive, as if every sense carries an extra layer of beauty. Now, as these synesthetic connections aren't optional, they're always there. And in a busy or chaotic environment, they could become super overpowering. I mean, imagine trying to focus while your brain is lighting up with sensory crosswalks. It can also be very isolating when others don't understand what it's truly like to experience the world this way. Explain to someone that Wednesday feels green or C sharp looks blue might lead someone to be more confused than connected, or they're going to think that person's being crazy. And while these associations are quite magical, they can also be very distracting, especially when precision or concentration is needed. Whether it feels like a superpower or something to navigate, it's just a reminder of how diverse and extraordinary human perception can truly be. The next classification is called a highly sensitive person. Being a highly sensitive person, or HSP, means experiencing the world in high definition. Coined by Dr. Elaine Aron in the 1990s, the term describes individuals who are more attuned to sensory stimuli, emotional nuances, or these subtle shifts in their environment. Research suggests that about 15 to 20% of the population falls into this category, making it a significant and unique way of being. At its core, high sensitivity comes with incredible gifts. HSPs often possess an extraordinary capacity for empathy, effortlessly tuning into the emotions and the needs of others. This is why many HSPs often identify as empaths. Now, while the term empath leans more towards a metaphysical term, emerging research like the role of mirror neurons provides a scientific basis for heightened emotional resonance. HSPs also tend to notice the smallest details that others might miss, whether it's a subtle change in body language, a shift in mood, or the way the light hits a room. This heightened awareness can make them very insightful and deeply observant. Then there's this rich inner life of an HSP. With vivid imaginations and this deep appreciation for art or music and beauty, HSPs can thrive on meaningful experiences. They often also possess a strong sense of intuition, enabling them to make thoughtful, well-informed decisions that others might overlook. These gifts can make HSPs not only compassionate and creative, but also deeply connected to the world around them. But as with any unique trait, high sensitivity comes with challenges. For HSPs, the very qualities that make life so vivid can also become extremely overwhelming. Loud noises, bright lights, crowded spaces, or even strong smells can feel like too much to handle. Chaotic environments may leave them drained, needing time to recharge. Their emotional intensity, while a strength, can also be exhausting. Processing and recovering from deeply felt experiences takes a lot of energy. Setting boundaries can also be a very strong struggle. Empathy and the desire to help can lead to people-pleasing tendencies or feeling drained by taking on too much. And sensitivity to criticism can really hit hard for them, affecting self-esteem or causing hesitation in taking risks. Now, all these challenges often lead to misdiagnoses. For example, these intense emotions and interpersonal sensitivity of HSPs can definitely resemble borderline personality disorder at first glance. Borderline personality disorder often involves instability in self-image, relationships, and this intense impulsivity, while HSPs experience more heightened sensitivity without those specific dynamics. For example, in borderline personality disorder is often driven from this deep-seated fear of abandonment, versus HSPs are more just responding to their environment. So it's probably not with every single person. However, these traits, though, I don't really consider should be a condition or anomaly, but something inherently human. Sensitivity to our surroundings and instincts would have been vital during our hunter-gatherer stage, ensuring survival by staying attuned to every sound, movement, and emotions. But somewhere along the way, societal changes have redefined what's important to notice. And there's a lot more going on in the environment that drowns out those little subtle hues. I also believe this is where most of what calls our psychic gifts lie. Being part of a spiritual community that embraces intuition and uniqueness, I believe that everyone in this group could really all fit under this so-called disorder, including myself. The next is sensory processing disorder, or SPD. Now, this is like having the brain's sensory dial tuned just a little differently. For some, it means hypersensitive to the world around them. Bright lights, loud noises, or even certain textures can feel extremely overwhelming. For others, it might mean being hyposensitive, where these sensations are muted and they crave more input to feel grounded. This condition affects how the brain processes and responds to sensory information, making certain environments or tasks very challenging. Now, people who are hypersensitive can develop a heightened awareness again of their surroundings. This ability to notice these fine details, whether in art, music, or even safety related situations, can be an incredible strength. And some describe their sensory experiences as richer and more nuanced, perceiving textures, color, or sounds in ways that others might overlook. In this sense, SPD can offer a unique lens from which to experience the world. And living with SPD also fosters adaptability. This need to navigate sensory challenges often leads to creative problem solving and resilience, skills that can serve well in many areas of life. Many individuals with SPD are also highly intuitive, picking up on the subtle shifts of their environment or in the emotions of others, something that can make them deeply perceptive and insightful. Still, the challenges of SPD are also very real. Overstimulation is a common hurdle, making everyday activities like grocery shopping or socializing very draining and overwhelming. Bright light, loud noises, or even certain textures can trigger discomfort or even distress. And for some, motor skills can also be another area or difficulty. Writing, buttoning clothes, or participating in sports may require more effort and patience. Social interactions can also be tricky because behaviors like avoiding certain foods or being particular about a certain type of clothing can lead to misunderstood or lead to labels such as being picky or you're just being difficult. And those misunderstandings can sometimes obviously result in feelings of isolation. And then, of course, there's the impact on daily life, like concentrating on noisy classrooms or managing routines where sensory inputs become too much can feel like an uphill battle. For many, these sensory struggles tie into emotional regulation, and with sensory overload leading to frustration, anxiety, or even emotional meltdowns. Fortunately, awareness and research around SPD is growing. Organizations like the Star Institute in Denver, Colorado are leading the charge, conducting research and offering resources to help individuals manage sensory challenges effectively, whether that be in childhood or adulthood. Of course, this next one I'm sure you guys have heard of, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And this is a neurodevelopmental condition that shapes how individuals process the world around them. It is often characterized by patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that can affect daily functioning. It's more typical, of course, to be diagnosed in childhood, but many people will continue to experience the symptoms well into adulthood. ADHD manifests uniquely in everyone, but it's often categorized into inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, or combined type. Now, while ADHD is often viewed through the lens of its challenges, it actually comes with remarkable gifts. Hyperfocus, for example, allows individuals to immerse themselves completely in activities that they're passionate about, leading to these bursts of impressive creativity and productivity. Many with ADHD are naturally innovative thinkers, generating ideas and making connections that others might not see. This creativity often stems from their brain's nonlinear way of processing information. There's also a spontaneity and adaptability that can make individuals with ADHD adventurous and quick to embrace change. For those that have this more hyperactive type, an abundance of energy can fuel physical activities, sports, or even dynamic projects. And their problem-solving skills, driven by this unique ability to think outside the box, often make them a standout in environments that call for creative solutions. Of course, ADHD presents a share of its own hurdles. Focusing on tasks that don't spark interest can be an ongoing struggle. It impacts school, work, or even daily routines. And this was a big factor for me when I got in college, where you're required to take electives. Now, for me, it was like I could be on the dean's list on one semester because I was taking the courses that I actually like and had an interest in. And then the next semester, I'd be forced to take other courses that I had no desire to be on, and I would be on academic probation because I just couldn't focus on them. I just didn't care. Of course, impulsivity can lead to acting without thinking, difficulty managing time, or interrupting others in conversations. Hyperactivity, particularly in structured environments like classrooms or offices, can often be challenging when stillness and quiet are expected. Emotional regulation can also be difficult, with intense feelings sometimes leading to frustration or being overwhelmed. And then there is the executive functioning challenges, such as planning, organizing, and managing priorities, which can make tasks like meeting deadlines or breaking down projects feel very daunting. But ADHD is far from one size fits all. For example, while many individuals with ADHD struggle with executive functioning, I actually tested in the top 2% for these skills. So that makes me an outlier. That said, though, time management has always remained a challenge for me. Problem solving is one of my greatest strengths in terms of ADHD, but that even has its own pros and cons because I am relentless when it comes to finding solutions. I will hyper focus to the point of exhaustion because I can't let problems go unresolved. Now, I wasn't diagnosed as a child, partly because ADHD wasn't really widely recognized during my upbringing. Looking back, though, I see the signs of it definitely in my family. My grandfather, for instance, was always starting projects that he never finished. Like each summer when we visited, his dining room table would be buried under these ever growing stacks of unfinished papers. But for parents who suspect that their child might have ADHD, I really do encourage to have a thoughtful approach to diagnosis and treatment. You have to understand we live in a fast paced, tech driven world, and environmental factors like excessive screen time or lack of outdoor play can sometimes mimic ADHD. I explore this concept further in lesson 7, where I discuss attention restoration theory. And so that might be something you want to look into before you assume that your child has ADHD. And it could be the reason why I wasn't diagnosed as a child, because we didn't have computers when I grew up. Also, when considering treatment, especially medication, it's really important to weigh all the options carefully. Now, medications are crucial when it comes to ADHD, and Adderall can be transformative for someone that truly has it, but it carries risks, particularly in younger individuals. Adderall contains methamphetamine salts. This is a class of drugs that is related to meth and will pose a risk of addiction. Developing brains already sensitive to dopamine-driven experiences can be particularly vulnerable if stimulant medications are prescribed unnecessarily. So I want to spend quite a bit of time here on this last aspect of neurodivergence, which is, of course, for autism spectrum disorder. There's so many stereotypes and misunderstandings about autism that it can be difficult to fully grasp how it presents and whether you might be on the spectrum without even realizing it. For a long time, autism was believed to be a male disorder. It's not that researchers thought females couldn't have autism, they just observed it more frequently in men. However, they were also not necessarily looking for it in females, as I mentioned earlier. One reason for this is that autism can present differently in females. Girls and women may develop more effective coping strategies to mask or camouflage their symptoms, contributing to underdiagnoses or a misdiagnosis. Now, masking is when they hide or suppress these autistic traits to fit in better with others to avoid being judged. It's like wearing a social mask to appear more what is expected in social settings. For example, someone might force themselves to make eye contact even though it feels uncomfortable. They might rehearse conversations in their head so it sounds more normal, or they'll mimic other facial expressions or tone of voice to seem more relatable. These coping strategies are often developed in childhood, so if one has never been properly diagnosed, they may not even realize that they're masking. That's why undiagnosed women can crash, because masking can lead to burnout, anxiety, or feeling like they're not truly being their true selves. It is often done, though, to avoid rejection or misunderstanding. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to force anybody into gender boxes. I'm speaking more on a biological sense. Most people are born with either two X chromosomes or one X and one Y chromosome, except, of course, in rare cases involving genetic mutations. But this biological difference matters regardless of gender identity. Hormones and neurotransmitters influenced by these chromosomes play a significant role in brain development. But the way our brains are shaped also involves a complex interplay between biology and environmental factors. Epigenetics highlights how these influences are affected by generations of primal instincts related to gender. This is obviously a more complex area of research, but it makes logical sense to me that epigenetics would play a role in why girls and women tend to develop masking as a coping strategy. Women have often been expected to be more socially adept and nurturing, which has created this evolutionary pressure to develop skills like social masking. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, because I need to back up to kind of explain what autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, actually looks like. Now, ASD is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by a broad range of challenges and differences in social communication, behavior, and sensory processing. I actually read that autism expressed itself uniquely in each person. Like, there's literally no two cases that are alike. There are underlying traits at play, but while some might express them prominently, others may not express them at all. There's even a form of autism that doesn't affect personality at all, but it affects just your digestive system. This suggests, though, that ASD develops and changes as a person grows, with both nature and nurture playing significant roles. The most common association when people think of autism, though, is this combination of social communication challenges paired with high intelligence. The TV show The Good Doctor is a popular example of this. And honestly, that's how I used to think of autism too. After learning about this perceived social deficit, I realized that my understanding of others has been limited to what I experienced firsthand. In my younger years, I was very sensitive to people's energies. Like if I sensed something was off about someone, I knew to steer clear. But as I've gotten older, that internal radar has failed me more than once. And this becomes especially difficult when dealing with someone that's a high functioning sociopath who can present themselves in ways that make them nearly impossible to detect their true nature. Because of this, I probably didn't set boundaries where others might have, because I've only perceived the danger when I'm explicitly aware to it. That is part of what made my experience with my ex so difficult, because up until then, my understanding of a sociopath came from what I learned about serial killers or high crime individuals. No one ever taught me what a high functioning, non criminal sociopath looks like or acts like. After experiencing this, though, firsthand, I began to identify patterns and cues based on my ex's behavior. But if I experienced something that I hadn't actually witnessed yet or gone through yet, I would end up in the same situation beating myself up because I didn't recognize the red flags. And I couldn't understand why I hadn't caught on earlier or seen the warning signs. Now, this is actually a struggle common among autistic individuals because they tend to experience intimate partner violence or domestic abuse and sexual assault at higher rates than non-autistic people, regardless of gender. And unfortunately, this pattern is often repeated throughout their lives. Autistic individuals struggle to trust both others and themselves when it comes to recognizing red flags. They may stay in an abusive relationship because they fail to recognize the abuse, lack the skills to actually respond effectively, or fear leaving due to limited opportunities for connection. On top of that, abusers often exploit autistic traits such as difficulties recognizing malicious intent or social cues. Another common misconception about social challenges in people with ASD is that they lack empathy or that they don't want to connect. It's not that ASD lacks empathy, rather that they may not know when or how to engage it if they struggle to pick up on these social cues. But understand that this isn't true for everybody on the spectrum. In fact, some individuals are on the actual extreme side of the empathy spectrum. Due to sensory sensitivities, they become overly empathetic, which is something I personally struggle with, especially when it comes to animals. For me, hearing any animal in distress, particularly dogs, is physically unbearable to me. I have to actively avoid hearing animal suffering because it triggers intense anxiety, or I'll have this emotional meltdown because I feel powerless that I'm not able to stop it. My ex actually used to make fun of me about how emotional I get over ASPCA commercials, but it was very real for me. And not having support in those moments was incredibly hard because it just made me feel like I was being too sensitive or overreacting. Sensory sensitivities in ASD, though, isn't limited to just empathy. Individuals may also be overly sensitive or undersensitive to light, sounds, and textures, or even smells. And this can result in sensory overload or a strong preference for specific sensory experiences. Many autistic individuals are deeply attuned to music or have sensitivities to certain sounds. For example, I cannot tolerate like repetitive, annoying noises, like someone chewing with their mouth open, which I know is an actual term for that, but I'm not sure what that is right off the top of my head. Or I can't handle like layered sounds like construction noises or multiple people talking at once. It like, becomes too overwhelming for me. But this leads me to another common trait against ASD. Now, people with ASD often have a focused and intense interest in specific topics. They may excel in areas like mathematics, art, music, technology, psychology. If ASD is combined with ADHD, which has an 85% comorbidity rate in women, these focus interests can turn into deep rabbit holes of hyperfocus, often delaying others' work or responsibility. And this, of course, is one of my greatest struggles and strengths. I have this insatiable appetite for knowledge, which allows me to learn and retain information very quickly if I'm genuinely interested in it. However, when I get into these rabbit holes, I often neglect other responsibilities, especially social commitments, until I feel satisfied with what I've learned. It's even more frustrating if the learning process, though, is too slow for me, which is why I prefer self-paced learning over traditional college settings. Another trait that I didn't realize was common among autistic individuals is called stimming. Stimming is short for self-stimulating behavior, which refers to repetitive actions or movements that help regulate sensory input, manage emotions, or provide comfort. And it can take many forms, such as humming, watching a moving object, finger tapping, or jumping. Now, personally, when I'm overexcited or very anxious about something, I tend to pace. If I'm experiencing extreme distress, then I have to actually sit with my knees tight to my chest and I'll rock. It's really important to allow an individual with ASD to stim as long as it's not causing them any harm. Some forms of stimming, like head banging or skin picking, can really become self-injurious. So in those cases, support may be needed to teach them alternative, safer methods of self-regulation. But even after learning all of this, I still wasn't fully convinced I was on the spectrum. I was really trying hard to avoid coming to terms with feeling too different from societal standards. Like I said, I knew that my thought process was unique, but I thought it was normal too, because I behaved and thought in a way that I thought morally people should. But that very statement right there is a huge indicator of my differences. I see the world through a lens that expects people to want to better themselves, which unfortunately doesn't really fully align with reality. The world is full of gray areas shaped by corruption, power, and greed. What seems simple to me, others tend to complicate, and I really struggle to understand that. Now, I thought that my views skewed a bit towards idealistic, but it really kind of turns out that they're actually more literal because I can't process behaviors that don't align with my standards. It like literally doesn't compute for me. Now I can try to rationalize or minimize actions that don't make sense. And I often feel compelled to share my perspective and help others realize this and their potential. For me, it's black and white. If I give you information to help you feel better, I expect you to use it. And I don't give up easily. Like if I don't see the change I expect, I'm going to present my case in very different ways through facts, statistics, human design, astrology, anything else in my tool belt. It becomes a hyper-focused rabbit hole that I cannot escape, even if the white rabbit kicks me out. And it will just linger on the back of my subconscious. And without closure, I can't let it go. Now, the best way that I can explain this is actually through computer programming. I have been teaching myself Python, and this is a programming language used to build apps and systems. Now, one type of command is a loop. It's called a while loop, which repeats a specific set of instructions until that end condition is met. If the code does not have the correct end condition or have one at all, it will become an infinite loop, just repeating over and over and over forever. And this is how my mind works, especially in relationships. I care about people based on how they present themselves. Their actions must align with their words because that's what I expect. If someone says they care about me, then logically they shouldn't want to hurt me. If they say I'm the best thing that's happened to them or they've won the relationship lottery, then they should want to protect and cherish that because they recognize the value in it. If they make a promise or give me their word, then they should keep it. But when their actions become inconsistent with their words, it kind of creates this error in my mental code, especially when the behavior is unexpected or they do not provide that end condition. They don't provide that closure. So I'm going to try to correct that error over and over again. And I'm caught in this infinite loop until I reach a breaking point because my mental system becomes overloaded just like a computer. When it's running that loop, it's going to eventually crash the system. Now, this intense response to these overwhelming situations is known as an autistic meltdown. However, I really do think that's a horrible label and it only contributes to this negative stereotypes about autism. I think a more empathetic version would be just autistic overload. Now, this occurs when a person with autism becomes overloaded by sensory input, emotions, or stress to a point where they can no longer manage or process their environment effectively. It's not something they can control. It often feels like this complete shutdown or a fight and flight reaction. And they're going to manifest differently for each individual because it depends on whether or not that person has other conditions like PTSD or how their body actually regulates emotion when they do feel out of control. Now, these emotions can become even more intense if that person is mimicking or absorbing the emotions around them. During these meltdowns or overloads, the communication can be very difficult or even impossible, even adding to the distress. For some, they may involve crying, screaming, hitting, kicking, demanding, or self-injury. But others may just shut down completely and become completely non-responsive. The duration and recovery time of a meltdown or overload vary from person to person. Often there's a lingering sense of shame or embarrassment afterwards, and so the individual may seek validation or reassurance from the other person. They may also, though, experience a kind of a freeze response afterwards, feeling physically and emotionally drained. This vulnerability is why it's especially dangerous for someone with ASD to be involved with a narcissistic or sociopathic person. Such individuals are unlikely to care or even understand the reasons that caused the meltdown, even if it was their own actions that triggered it. Instead, they'll use that to manipulate and belittle the person with ASD, making them feel even worse and labeling them as crazy or unstable. All the while, they're going to maintain this cool, calm, and collective facade. However, for me, it's not just in relationships. I mean, it's in a multiple aspects of life. I mentioned I'm dealing with this legal issue and I've been forcing to defend myself in court. I mean, to me, the case is black and white. Like, laws have been violated, and I have proof to back that up. Yet, even with all of this information, I still didn't believe that it meant I was autistic. I don't understand how expecting people to behave decently and having a strong sense of justice can be considered a disorder. Well, it's not. It's just an uncommon way of thinking, I guess. Many of the traits I've described are actually common among women on the autism spectrum. Samantha Kraft, an autistic woman and expert on the subject, has become the go-to resource for women wondering if they may be on the spectrum. After being diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, she has spent over 17 years researching autism, and particularly in women, and has compiled a list of 173 different traits frequently seen in autistic women. When I went through her list, I found that I related to almost 70% of those traits. But I was far from being upset about it. I mean, I actually truly felt seen for the first time in my life. Like, some of the traits on this list that I strongly resonate with was like finding it difficult to understand manipulation and disloyalty, having trouble with lying, escaping through mental processing, which is called intellectualization, being highly empathetic, questioning whether or not I'm a normal person, and having huge compassion for those who are suffering. I also try to help whenever I can, often offering unsolicited advice, and constantly formalize plans of actions to improve things. Other traits included questioning my life purpose and striving to be this better person, seeking to understand my abilities and my gifts, struggling to accept that people aren't always honest, and expecting that certain actions should yield certain results, even when dealing with emotion. I often feel confused when others ostracize, betray, or belittle me. And I also find myself feeling sorry for people even if they have hurt me. I can identify with personal feelings like anger, outrage, deep love, and fear, but I struggle with feeling emotions such as joy, calmness, or satisfaction. I'm also fascinated by the origin of words and historical facts, and have a high interest in songs and song lyrics specifically, which is quite fascinating. Frequently noticing patterns, remembering exact details about people's lives, and having a remarkable memory for specific details. And I also write to relieve my anxiety. Additionally, a strong need for routine, structure, and a sense of justice is also common for both men and women that are on the spectrum. The desire to live in a world based on fairness and justice is often deeply ingrained in all autistic individuals. I have finally come to terms with it. I'm not fucking normal. I never have been, and now I know why. But I still can't seem to reconcile why these traits are considered a disorder. If being normal means accepting dishonesty and betrayal without a question, then I would rather embrace a diagnosis that sets me apart. I wish more people were like me. Maybe then there would have fewer problems in the world. Because despite my complex mind, I actually see things very simply. And I often think it's neurotypical people who tend to make life unnecessarily complicated. Take relationships, for example. They're often made complex by past trauma and fear, but in reality, they're quite simple. All it takes is three very essential ingredients: love, respect, and honesty. When you have those, open communication, meeting and supporting each other's needs, and remaining faithful will naturally follow. Understand, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying that it's simple. It does take an immense amount of self-awareness, and that's why these ingredients aren't just for your partner, but also for yourself. To love who you are, respect yourself enough to heal and to seek help for trauma, and be honest with yourself when you're facing your fears. Complicating things leads to division, which can escalate into catastrophes such as war, famine, and the destruction of natural resources. Yet that's considered normal. Maybe that is the reason, though, why there's been a rise in neurodivergence. I mean, what if being neurodivergent isn't a disorder at all? What if it's a part of an evolutionary shift, something that's meant to not help just humanity survive, but also the planet? Now, this is something I truly do believe, and I'm going to tie this back into human design here shortly. Traits that are considered a part of evolution often give us an edge in adapting to new environments. They might seem different at first, but they can turn out to be incredibly useful in certain situations. On the other hand, a disorder typically means something that causes significant difficulties or suffering in daily life without any clear benefit. The key difference is whether the trait helps us thrive in some ways, or does it just make life harder? Also, the way society views these traits also matter because over time, traits that were once seen as disabilities are being recognized for their strength. But if society only focuses on the challenges without seeing the potential, these traits then stay labeled as a disorder. Neurodivergent traits like ADHD and autism have strong genetic links, and they're often written into our DNA and passed down through our families. Despite the conspiracy theories of what causes autism, it is something that is ingrained at birth. These traits just look different depending on the environment. For example, a child with ADHD might thrive in a more hands on, creative environment, but will struggle in a rigid traditional classroom. But this also leads to a bigger question, of course. Where do we draw the line between evolutionary shift and a disorder? Because the answer sometimes isn't always clear. I mean, take something like narcissism or sociopathy. These are traits that are typically seen as very harmful, and they are. But as an individual, they can provide advantages like confidence or this quick decision making, but as a whole, they often hurt society more than they help. But do these traits have evolutionary roots? Because it's something that's worth considering, even if the idea feels uncomfortable. I recently came across a study proposed that antisocial personality disorder was a neurodevelopmental condition. Antisocial people often have differences in their brain structure, particularly in the areas like the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, which are involved in decision making, empathy, and emotional regulation. Now, these differences can be influenced by genetics, early trauma, or even stress during pregnancy. In other words, their brains might be wired differently from birth, much like ADHD and autism. But this is what becomes tricky. They don't know if the brain actually develops differently because one person has antisocial, or do you become antisocial because the brain is developing differently? It's kind of like the chicken or the egg situation. Either way, though, it is clear that both genetics and environments play a role because those that have antisocial personality disorder have a 50% chance of heritability. As more and more people become neurodivergent, however you want to classify it, society seems to be kind of splitting into two very different extremes. If science doesn't start becoming more open-minded and stop being so judgmental, we may end up hurting society more than helping, especially if something comes about where a new species is in fact born. It would be remiss of me not to bring up human design because Ra Ura Hu, the founder of human design, predicted the rise of autism back in the 1990s. Now, he claimed it was part of what's coming in 2027, marking this emergence of a new species. I'm going to spare you the full story, but if you are interested in knowing more about it, you can watch these two videos that I have on my channel. But what's interesting is that this new species is said to have these unique traits that society will label as a problem instead of embracing them when they're first born. He said that these versions of these traits, though, will start to show up in humans born closer to 2027, like different versions of these. Well, if you took all the neurodevelopment disorders that I particularly spoke about and put them in one person, they reflect an eerily similar prototype of the species that he called the Rave. However, there is still a distinct difference because the Rave will not have a single consciousness, but a group consciousness, which honestly wouldn't be surprising from an evolutionary perspective. Species survive more in groups, and that's why social species are more successful. If I go back to what I was speaking about earlier in regards to evolutionary shifts happen for survival, it would show that neurodivergence, aside from personality disorders, will most likely thrive. What was even more interesting, as I was about to record this lesson, I came across a National Geographic article that was titled, "This is how autism looks different in girls and women." Talk about a generator response right there. In 2012, the British sociologist Damien Milton proposed the double empathy problem, which states that communication difficulties are a result of different experiences, and that people who experience the world in the same way are more likely to successfully interact. He said, like, if you brought autistic people together and had them work on something, what ends up happening is that they actually collaborate pretty darn well, and they understand each other pretty darn well, and they empathize with each other pretty darn well. Now, that collaboration reflects a group consciousness. Group consciousness could enhance coordination, reduce conflict, and enable rapid adaptation to environmental and societal changes. So it's no surprise that something like the Rave being born with a group consciousness makes sense because you can think of it kind of like a beehive, right? Like individual bees don't act independently. Their actions serve the hive as a whole. Similarly, though, the Rave might function like individual nodes in a collective mind, but they're only going to function when they're actually in the hive. If they're not in the hive, they don't function. Right now, if we're not in a hive, we can still figure out a way to function. Now, whether that comes to pass or not, another key point, though, is that this current societal splits also aligns with this whole 2027 prediction because of the new incarnation cross that we're transitioning into. Honestly, like the recent election even supports this prophecy or theory even more, given the collapse of governmental institutions and this massive distrust in leadership. Rob believed that autism wasn't a disorder at all. He believed it was a gift. It was to show who's evolving and that those that possess this gift will be the ones that people will end up turning to when everything goes to shit. So, with everything aside, science, my theories, now what? It's really crucial for me to review my past when I've gained new insights. After all, like those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, right? I really had to grasp an understanding of how ASD presents and how it overlaps when it does come to other conditions, like I mentioned prior. Because I had a question like, did my ex actually have like antisocial personality, or was he on the spectrum and that he just had these traits that express more negatively due to his traumatic childhood? I mean, he definitely has sensory sensitivities, frequent shutdowns resembling these meltdowns, and he had ADHD. So I wondered, like, was it that he truly lacked empathy, or did he not know how to engage it? But I said the nuances matter. The intent behind his actions did not meet the criteria for ASD, but instead for antisocial. His pathological lying, the complete lack of motivation to change, his deliberate avoidance of empathy to dodge feelings of guilt or remorse didn't fit well with the profile for someone with just ASD. Because in the end, I thought about it like, if he realized like this was me, like how my behavior was because I was due to this, would that have changed his behavior? And no, it wouldn't have. He wouldn't have met my needs or taken my insights any differently. If anything, he probably would have used that against me. So while he may be on the spectrum, he likely has a core morbidity of ASD, ADHD, and antisocial. But I also went through all of my intimate relationships. I analyzed each of the breaking points, the triggers, how I communicated, and how each one ended. I combined that with the reanalyzation of my own human design chart, and I really discovered this beautiful roadmap. I actually believe that all of my past partners are on the spectrum to some degree. And that isn't surprising. Like they said, like when you collaborate with the same type of mental processing, that's going to be more successful. And my Venus is in Virgo in the ninth house, which means I'm going to be drawn to people who share a similar level of intelligence with me. However, I also noticed that many of them exhibited these antisocial traits to a varying extent, but some did learn and grow while others have not. Idea aligns with the fact that in men, like autism trait will be less masked because it's more normal for society to reward or overlook antisocial behavior in males. Either way, the key distinction is that men who are on the spectrum, who only have ASD, if it's really autism that's driving these traits, they shouldn't display dramatic shifts in behaviors because there should be kind of a routine or a cycle. They shouldn't lack empathy. They may not know when to engage it, and they should have a genuine desire to improve themselves once it's pointed out, not to avoid it because they don't want to deal with the guilt or the shame that comes with it. But it wasn't always just about the partner, right? Because I also discovered there was a problem with me, and it was not understanding that the needs I have are not just something that I'm looking for, but these are actual needs I have to feel safe and secure. And they're not something I can compromise anymore. Now, even though I did learn to express them more openly after my ex, I was very open though about what I needed from the last person. But in fact, I mean, I even begged for it at the end to avoid having that infinite loop repeat itself. But the problem was I didn't enforce them soon enough, or I didn't stand by my boundaries when I set them because I wasn't able to see the red flags as well as everybody else did. But I've also learned from that. And that was something that was obviously needed. And I reached a breaking point in terms of boundaries, which I've been sticking to. And I am so proud of myself for that. Let me say, it is not easy to say to somebody, hey, I need you not to do this because I am not capable of handling it or understanding that without feeling like you're being neurotic, demanding, or risking them not wanting to move forward because they think that there's something wrong with you. But that is what boundaries are all about. It's knowing the rules of the game before you start to play it. If they don't want to follow the rules, well, they don't get to be in the game. I had to teach myself to look at relationships the same way I process everything else, strategically and simply. I was complicating it when I worried too much about hurting the other person or that I was misjudging the situation. I am a peer generator that is meant to bring awareness to others. It is part of my design. I am meant to nourish their self-awareness and not to question my gut instinct. So that is what I'm going to attract, those that need that self-awareness. But I can only give it when my cup is full and not running on empty because I feel like I need to prove myself to them. So in this past year, and especially within these past 5 months, even prior to me finding out this about myself, I was really starting to do that. And I feel like I am finally there because I've had 2 instances now where I've expressed what I needed. I set a boundary, I gave them the opportunity to provide an answer. And when both failed to meet the need I expressed, I put it to an end. I didn't have to have closure. I didn't have to have that infinite loop because I didn't allow it to get that far. So either I've truly learned and healed from past experiences, or I've just witnessed all the red flags known to man in the past 4 years that my stellar memory is immediately triggered the moment I see one. Either way, the most important thing about this discovery about myself is that it hasn't hurt me. It's made me actually more confident and understanding. And if you are someone who feels different, or you've been told you're different, or you struggle with being labeled with a disorder, remember, it's really truly about perspective. You can choose to embrace it, learn more about it, learn more about yourself, or you can let it define you and become a victim. But before you do the latter, consider this. Being the norm is like being cubic zirconia. It's common, it's easily replicated, then it doesn't really hold any true value. Being different though, well, that's much like being a colored diamond, which are considered the rarest type. Of course, red being the rarest with less than 30 ever discovered. These diamonds are highly sought after and they sell for millions, which concludes my point in this lesson. Being different isn't bad, it's actually priceless.